皆さん、こんにちは。ファン研究グループの動画です。今回は、マラヤ大学のロスリナ・イスマイル先生と、リュウ先生をお招きして、マレーシアにおけるムスリム女性のパンク運動、パンク文化について、ご解説いただくことにしています。まずは、事前に録画したロスリナ先生の、講義の動画をご覧ください。
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Roslina and I'm with Dr. Meng Ye Liu. We are the researcher for the construction of self-identity and expression of female Muslim punks in Malaysia through dress. We would like to express our thank to Tsukuba University, especially to Dr. Koki Matabe and team for inviting us so that we can share our exciting findings from our research on punk subculture, specifically for female Muslim punk in Malaysia. Punk and religion are often seen antagonistic to one another. The subculture's aggressive and unconventional visual style serves as a direct challenge to dominant norms of beauty and femininity, which sharply contrasts with Islamic cultural expectation of modesty in women's dress. Despite the presence of female punks, traditional ethnographic investigation often ignore and portray girls uncritically to support the stereotypical images of women. Furthermore, a Western-centric perspective of punk narratives limits our understanding of its significance in different socio-cultural contexts. To address these academic gaps, our ethnographic research explores the heart of Malaysia's punk scene, with a special focus on female Muslim participants. Using dress as a lens, it explores the intersection of gender, religion, and punk subculture participation. Their styles reflect a dynamic negotiation of cultural norms, subculture affiliation, and personal authenticity, showing how global subcultures like punk adapt to local contexts while offering insights into subculture identity, resistance, and adaptation. The main purpose of our study is to investigate the ways in which female Muslim punks express themselves, construct and maintain their identities, as well as impose meanings and resist dominant norms through their subculture dress in Malaysia. In this research, we looked at the sartorial practices of self-identified female Muslim punks in Malaysia and explored how these practices shape their understanding of punk culture. We wanted to understand how these women use fashion to navigate the tension between their various identities. Ultimately, we examined the deeper cultural meaning of punk dress among these women in Malaysia. The study challenges the traditional view of punk subcultures as homogeneous entities, highlighting the dynamic and evolving nature of punk in response to various local contexts, thus inviting a re-evaluation of existing subculture theories, especially in terms of gender, religion, and cultural adaptation. Punk culture in Malaysia emerged in the early 1980s as part of a broader global youth movement that embraced rebellion, individuality, and resistance to societal norms. For urban Malay youth, punk became one of the most prominent subcultures, alongside heavy metal, in challenging dominant cultural narratives. This subculture were formed as a response to societal pressures, particularly in the context of rapid urbanization and the tension between traditional values and modernity. Punk music, fashion, and ideology became a form of identity for youth who felt marginalized and disconnected from mainstream society. However, the punk subculture in Malaysia has faced significant negative portrayals in the media, often influenced by the government and conservative religious institutions. The media's sensationalized coverage of punk linked it with criminal behavior, drug abuse, and anti-Islamic activities. This report often depicted punk youth as rebellious and disconnected from the traditional values of Malay society, leading to the perception that the subculture posed a moral threat to the nation's fabric. punk was depicted as part of a broader Western cultural invasion, which was viewed as corrupting the youth of Malaysia. This stigmatization of punk culture led to moral panics, where the subculture was vilified as a cause of social decay. These fears were not just a media construct but were amplified by public figures. Politicians and religious leaders frequently referred to punk culture and other underground subcultures like black metal as threats to social order, further worsening the stereotype of punks as societal folk devils. As a result, punk culture in Malaysia has faced not only societal rejection but also legal and physical repression, including police raids and arrests of punk youth. Despite this, punk continues to be a resilient subculture, offering a marginalized youth a platform for self-expression and a critique of both political and cultural constraints. The punk movement in Malaysia, much like elsewhere in the world, represent a form of resistance to societal expectations and a search for alternative cultural identities in the face of modern challenges. We did an extensive pre-study before the research officially begins. It involved attending gigs and conducting participants observation and exploring Instagram to identify local punks to have conversation with. Through this pre-study, we were able to identify various key venues, which host underground live music shows and events in a wide range of genres, including metal, punk, indie, hip-hop, jazz, and so on. For participant recruitment, we started by searching through social media such as Instagram and Facebook with hashtags of punk-related teams to identify those who potentially meet the eligibility criteria of this study, supplemented by posting digital flyers through our personal account. Additionally, we attended local gigs to conduct impromptu recruitment to overcome the limitation of recruiting through social media and also increase the chance of recruitment. Following this initial recruitment phase, a snowball strategy was implemented to further recruit participants by leveraging the social networks of existing participants. In the end, our participant recruitment effort resulted in 7 participants aged 21 to 38 who self-identified as Muslim, women, and punk. This group comprised 4 active musicians from 3 local punk bands and 3 punk fans. This study employed a visual ethnographic approach, integrating images, objects, description with traditional ethnographic methods like in-depth semi-structured interviews and participant observation. During our fieldwork, we collected over 1,700 photos and over 200 videos to capture the dynamic of the local scene. The study was approved by Universiti Malaya Research Ethics Committee, and ethical considerations are rigorously applied throughout the study. One of the key venues for local punk scene in Kuala Lumpur is Rumah Api, or literally translated as firehouse, a space that regularly hosts punk gigs and functions as a grassroots cultural hub. It's more than just a gig venue. It's a place for workshop, activism, and community building across different social groups. For example, on International Women's Day, Rumah Api holds special gigs to celebrate women in the scene. What made the event particularly meaningful was that every band performing that day included at least one female member. The first figure in the left corner showed a Rumah Api promoting a clean lifestyle, reflecting the ethical values embraced by the community. We attended this Women's Day gig, which also featured an art exhibition showcasing work by female artists from within the punk scene. Here you can see recordings and then DIY t-shirts, prints, print cards and many others, all done by women in punk, the punk women during the International Women's Day. This slide highlights some additional gig venues around Greater Kuala Lumpur. Here we can see the gig venue, the Greater Kuala Lumpur. We visited Drum Asia Studio, Angguk Studio, the Paddock, and many others. So these are the scene outside and the gigs happening and the performers, and also some events happening around here at the Paddock. Then we also followed our participants that we have recruited on a gig tour in Malacca. Malacca is a state further down south of the Peninsular Malaysia. Well, in Malacca, these venues are often tucked away and hard to find, even with the location details. The entrances are usually quite hidden. Here we can see the punk scene in Malaysia. Although it is quite small, it's vibrant and tightly knit community. It's largely dominated by Muslim men. Right. What really stands out is how strong the social connection are. Even those who don't actively attend gigs still find ways to contribute. Some are university lecturers writing about punk in academic journals, while others might be songwriters or artists supporting the scene from behind the scenes. Everyone participates in their own way. At the core of this scene is a shared belief in resistance and DIY, or do-it-yourself ethics. For many Muslim punks in Malaysia, punk isn't just about the music or fashion. It's a tool, a way to push back against societal norms, to challenge authority, and to live with a sense of ethical responsibility. Take Rumah Api, for example, one of the most iconic venues in Kuala Lumpur. It's not just a place to host gigs. It's a space that actively promotes anti-drug, anti-racism, and anti-sexism values through music, zines, and public discussion. For punk here, it's about more than looking the part. It's about living with integrity, about standing for something bigger than yourself. That same spirit carries through their day-to-day practices. Many punk in the scene embrace recycling, self-reliance, and grassroots activism. There are community-led initiatives like Food Not Bombs, where volunteers cook and distribute free meals to the homeless, and the really free market, which is all about sharing resources without money involved. This project reflects punk's deeper social responsibility, one rooted in care, not chaos. From what we've observed in the field, and on average, each gig draws about 40 to 50 participants. Out of that number, there are usually fewer than 10 women, including both Muslim women who wear the hijab and those who don't. There are fewer than 5 punk bands in Malaysia with female Muslim members, and all of them are based in Kuala Lumpur. Our study specifically focuses on these female Muslim punks, exploring how they navigate and express their identities within this subcultural space. We focus on them because they sit at a unique intersection, where punk ethos of rebellion and visibility meets the Islamic expectation of modesty and restraint, creating powerful tensions and negotiations in how they dress, perform, and exist in the scene. In this page, demonstrate our participants with their age by the time that the data collected, from P1 to P4 here. So these are the age. P1 is 37, P2 38, P3 is 35, and P4 21. All are punk musicians in the local scene. P1, P2, P3, and P5. Here, P5, all have over 15 years experiences in the local punk scene. P3 is one of the founders of Malaysia's first all-girl punk band. In our paper titled Sartorial Subversion in Subculture of Malaysian Female Muslim Punk, we explored how these women interpret punk through their styles. We found that the study of Malaysian female Muslim punks is not just about a unique manifestation of punk culture. It is about understanding the complexities of identity formation in a space where global influences meet local cultural and religious norms. Our research highlights the need to consider local context in subculture studies and opens up new avenues for exploring the diverse expressions of subcultures worldwide. The Malaysian punk scene blends global punk ideals with local adaptations, grounded in a DIY ethos that prioritize authenticity over commercial success. Central to this culture is the subversion of mainstream norms and an emphasis on individuality. As participant 4 noted, we don't need the quantity of money, we need the quality of our life, reflecting the scene's rejection of corporate sponsorship to maintain punk's deconstructive nature. This rejection of commercialism pervades every aspect of punk, from music production to fashion. Punk fashion in Malaysia directly reflects this DIY culture. Participants like Participant 3 proudly creates their own design. Punk jackets are adorned with studs and patches that symbolize individual journeys, while deviations from this ethos, such as outsourcing clothing creation, are criticized for being inauthentic. The scene's reliance on local social network for both music and fashion strengthens its sense of community. Punk bands source merchandises from independent creators, fostering solidarity and ensuring that each purchase reinforces communal ties. The exchange of band t-shirts at gigs exemplifies this collective spirit, where community takes precedence over individual profit. Beyond music and fashion, the DIY ethos extends to activisms, with participants engaging in initiatives like Food, Not Bombs, an anarchist movement that distribute food to the homeless. This collective action connects Malaysian punks to a global anarchist network while retaining a distinct local identity. Overall, the Malaysian punk scene exemplifies how global subcultures like punk are reshaped by local cultural contexts. Its deconstructive nature challenges fixed subcultural identities and highlights the fluid, dynamic ways in which cultural expression evolve in a globalized world. Punk provides a platform for creative resistance. Punk dress in Malaysia is not governed by rigid rules, but instead a canvas for personal expression. Participants' perspective reflect this spirit. Punk fashion, they assert, has no predefined rules. What matters is expressing one's true self, not conforming to an idealized punk look. This rejection of uniformity challenges traditional views of punk, often framed as a collective identity with strict aesthetic standards. The Malaysian punk scene actively deconstructs cultural norms through dress. One of our participants highlighted the tension between punk's embrace of freedom and the strict dress codes imposed by religion, noting that punk's appeal lies in its freedom from such rules. This ethos of non-conformity is prevalent among women, as they subvert traditional expectation by wearing clothing that reflects personal identity rather than conformity to external expectation. For example, participant 6 uses mainstream fashion to defy local cultural expectation. Her choice of a crop top and shorts fashion choices often deemed inappropriate for Muslim women reflects a rejection of societal restriction and a desire for freedom. As she explained, her style isn't a rebellion against Islam, but an expression of personal freedom. In this context, punk fashion is a dynamic, context-dependent expression that deconstructs the dichotomy between mainstream fashion and subculture, offering a fluid space for individual expression and collective resistance. The local punk scenes illustrate the ongoing evolution of punk as it adapts to local socio-cultural contexts. The absence of a unified punk style does not weaken the subculture's identity, but rather reinforces its core values of rebellion, freedom, and the continuous redefinitions of norm. The Malaysian punk scene demonstrates a unique fusion of Islamic symbols and punk aesthetic, creating a space for cultural reinterpretation and resistance. This stylistic blending reflects Derrida's 1997 concept of deconstruction, where elements of a cultural heritage are borrowed to challenge and redefine established norms. In this context, participants integrate Islamic attire such as the hijab and baju kurung, a two-piece traditional wear that is worn by Malay women, with punk fashion to contest traditional interpretations of both global subcultures and local norms. This fusion exemplifies the transformative redefinition of cultural practices, signaling punk's evolving nature in Malaysia. So this is the baju kurung. So you have a two-piece here, one long skirt and like a midi top. For instance, our participant wearing baju kurung, a traditional Malay garment at punk gigs, reinterprets the garment cultural symbolism within a punk context, merging Malay femininity with punk rebellion. This challenges the masculine aesthetic typically associated with Western punk fashion, highlighting the dynamic interplay between local and global influences. In addition, there are participants who wear the hijab while performing hardcore punk music, further illustrate this fusion, as they use the hijab, a symbol of religious adherence to Islam, to challenge societal expectation. By embracing the hijab within a punk context, they disrupt the binary of religious conformity versus punk rebellion, demonstrating that these elements can coexist and even reinforce one another. This redefinition of punk identity challenges the conventional understanding of authenticity within the subculture. The fusion shows that authenticity in punk can extend beyond the traditional markers of resistance. Just choices emphasize personal authenticity, moving away from rigid stereotypes and redefining punk as a space for individual expressions. This transformation underscores the flexibility of punk culture and its capacity to adapt and thrive within specific socio-cultural contexts. Based on these findings, our research introduces the localization of subculture, a framework that explores global punk ideologies in local contexts. Rooted in deconstruction, it emphasizes characteristics of authenticity over commercialism, a community-driven creation and consumption, deconstruction of cultural norms, and stylistic fusion and cultural reinterpretation. This framework shows how Malaysian punk navigates global and local influences, highlighting its adaptability and intricate local relationship, which can be applied to analyze other subculture in different countries, of course, and different contexts. In our next paper, we examine the specific dress strategies employed by these women to navigate and negotiate the tension between their intersecting identity. This finding extend the framework of localization of subculture that we introduced previously by identifying key sartorial strategies used by these participants to adapt their subcultural identities, including selective adoption of punk symbols, before and after punk transition, subtle incorporation of punk elements, and clothing as a disguise. These strategies highlight the agency in maintaining a coherent sense of self while navigating complex social landscape. The first strategy is to explore the selective adoption of punk symbols to express their punk identity, to create shared language within their subculture. Their situational adoption of certain symbols such as mohawks and extreme accessories primarily during performance, which highlights how these styles are specifically activated to project and communicate a punk identity within the local scene. This strategic use of appearance points towards understanding subculture identity as possibly being situational, indicating how individuals might navigate the varied aspects of their identity in different contexts by selectively adopting symbols to adapt and shift roles and communicate specific messages with particular audiences through style. The second strategy, before and after punk transition. It highlights a visual transformation in participants' appearance, from traditional feminine style to punk-inspired attire, which reveals how clothing communicates belonging, negotiates identity, and engages with social world. Rooted in symbolic interactionism, it highlights the agency in redefining themselves and illustrates identity negotiation through styles as a participative and dynamic process. The third strategy is subtle incorporation of punk symbol. Participants or the women strategically adapt their dress style to navigate and negotiate their overlapping identities, punk, Muslim, and female, within various social contexts. This includes a strategy that subtly blends punk aesthetic in their attire, allowing them to express individuality while respecting specific context outside the punk scene. It highlights how individuals use dress to engage in social negotiation and cultural dialogue. The next strategy they use is about using clothing as a disguise to conceal participant punk identity in certain situations. Kara covers her punk attire around her parents, and Gina uses hijab to conceal bleached hair at her university. In their context, the hijab is not just a sign of religious and cultural conformity, but also a tool for balancing their punk identity with the expectations of their family and the educational environments. This adaptation highlights the agency in forging the identities that balance their individuality and cultural ties. This finding challenged the notion of subcultural style as about purely resistant. They can also be about seeking integration and bridging multiple social worlds, which reveals these styles as complex, adaptive, responsive to intersecting pressures of gender, religion, and cultural norms. In the exploration of deeper cultural meaning of their dress practices, we found that their sartorial practices function as sites of negotiation, where intersecting identities are reconfigured. Punk's inherent deconstructive nature allows them to challenge both local cultural norms and global punk conventions, redefining freedoms as the ability to choose and express one's identity without conforming to external pressures. For some, this means prioritizing comfort and authenticity over traditional modesty norms. For others, freedom involves adapting punk elements to align with religious values, such as wearing a hijab while embracing punk aesthetics. The sartorial choices demonstrate that punk style is not about rigid conformity, but about personal expression. These women also navigate intersecting cultural fields, merging Islamic modesty with punk's rebellious ethos to create new forms of cultural capital. However, this freedom is not without backlash, as they face criticism for blending seemingly incompatible elements, such as the hijab with hardcore music. This backlash highlights the gendered nature of religious and cultural expectation, as women's appearance is more heavily scrutinized than men's, especially within conservative Islamic contexts. Despite these challenges, their fashion choices reflect a broader form of resistance, one that reinterprets cultural and religious norms. By embracing punk and Islamic values, they challenge stereotypes and promote inclusivity, showing that personal autonomy and religious identity can coexist, thereby reshaping cultural norms within both the punk scene and broader Malaysian society. Another findings that we can highlight is how women in Malaysia's punk scene use dress as a tool for empowerment, integrating punk aesthetic with local cultural and religious norms to assert agency, challenge stereotypes, and negotiate multiple identities. Their distinctive style, including punk elements like mohawks and body modification, serve as expression of individuality and resistance. This sartorial choice enhances their self-confidence and emotional resilience, offering both a personal and collective sense of empowerment. Some women emphasize how their styles reflect strength and autonomy, with punk fashion becoming a form of defiance against patriarchal control and societal expectations. Some participants also find that punk attire functions as a coping mechanism for mental health struggles, creating a space for emotional support and stability. Our participant 3, her experience further illustrates how gender dynamics can shift within the punk scene, where her female identity provides unique privileges, such as higher pay and more performance opportunity, challenging the conventional gender hierarchies in subculture spaces. Additionally, these women, particularly those wearing hijabs, break boundaries by participating in punk and other traditionally male-dominated activities, redefining what it means to be a woman in both subculture and society. Ultimately, their clothing choices embody a hybrid of resistance and empowerment, blending religious and cultural expectation with subcultural authenticity. This negotiation allows them to navigate complex identity intersections, promoting inclusivity and redefining culture and cultural norms. Our study reveals how Muslim punk women in Malaysia use their sartorial practices as a dynamic form of resistance, deconstructing societal norms related to gender, religion, and subculture. By blending global punk aesthetics with local religious values, these women create a hybrid cultural capital that reshapes cultural boundaries and fosters social change. This active engagement with dress challenges prevailing categories and stigma, emphasizing the individualized and evolving nature of punk identity in Malaysia. The research highlights the importance of local environment in shaping subcultural styles. The intersection of punk and Islam in Malaysia does not dilute punk's anti-establishment ethos. Instead, it repoliticizes it within the local context. This localization of subculture framework demonstrates punk's adaptability, illustrating how a global influence can be reinterpreted locally. Our findings also challenge assumption about punk being a male, white, and secular space. These women push the boundaries of gender norms and subcultural participation, fostering inclusivity and contributing to broader conversations on gender equality and social inclusion. By situating religion as a source of agency, not just constraint, our study advocates for intersectional approaches in subculture studies. Ultimately, this research reframes subculture as creative spaces for identity formation and encourages future studies to explore how subcultures adapt and transform across global and local contexts. Here you can see this is me. This is me, myself, Roslina, and Dr. Liu. We are on our first trip, our first trip to at Rumah Api to look at to scout participants and to do some participant observation. This is Mia or Dr. Liu with one of the participants here. So we had a really good time, and it was a really interesting findings for us, and an eye-opening about how the deconstruction of punk or subculture through local context, and how negotiating gender, religion, cultural, societal expectation for these women, how they have brilliantly negotiated it, and what are the ethos of punk subculture in Malaysia. It's not just about resistance, it's not just about anarchists, it's about social freedom, it's about freedom of expression, and it's also about social inclusion and gender equality. So I end this presentation. Thank you for listening. I'm look forward for our question and answer session soon. Dr. Liu, Dr. Meng Ye Liu, or I call her Mia, Dr. Mia, and myself will be there to answer any question or inquiries or comment. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this.
はい。皆さんありがとうございます。ロスリーナ先生の動画、オンラインの講義をご覧いただけたと思います。ここからはロスリーナ先生と、共著者の、リュウ先生に、ご参加いただいて Q&A セッションを行いたいと思います。So, let me switch to English from here. And let me briefly introduce Professor, Associate Professor Roslina Ismail and Dr. Mia Liu, the authors of the articles on Muslim punk movement in Malaysia. So here is Roslina Ismail from Associate Professor at University of Malaya, and the other is Dr. Mia Liu. So please briefly introduce yourself to the Japanese audience.
Hi, I'm Roslina. Thank you for inviting us for this lecture. And basically, this research is also Dr. Mia's. We call her Dr. Meng Ye, Dr. Mia's PhD project. So she's the researcher who went for the field work, for the interviews and ethnography, visual ethnography. I was a supervisor. So the project is about, at first it started out as a fashion, looking at fashion, because Dr. Mia was a fashion scholar. So she's very interested to see how dress can be seen as a form of activism, form of expression, right? So sartorial expression, and we're looking at subculture. So then we embarked into this, which we will explain further. So basically, I'm a lecturer in Faculty of Creative Arts under the Visual Art program. There are 4 departments: dance department, music department, visual art, and also music department. We have 7, about 6 lecturers in visual art program. So my background was actually from art science. I am working on art science convergence, especially now looking at post-humanism and object-oriented ontology of AI and human. So this is something that is my pet subject now, which I think last Friday I was interviewed by a news reporter asking about AI and art. Is it going to be the death of artists and things like that? It's the normal question. So I'm looking at it from post-humanist and object non-human agency in art creating. So, and also on subculture, which is also my subject. So that's all from me.
Thank you.
Dr. Mia.
Okay. Hi everyone. I'm very glad to join this online lecture. And I'm from a fashion background. I did my bachelor and master degrees both in fashion design, and I was doing PhD study under supervision of Dr. Roslina at the University Malaya Faculty of Creative Arts. And my research interest is in how fashion acting as a critical tool to express and construct our identities. And I'm also into this kind of edgy kind of styles. So I got to know there's a very vibrant underground scene in Malaysia, and this is how we come up with this whole project with my supervisor together. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your self-introduction. And let me move on to a quick response from me to Professor Roslina Ismail's online lecture. And here I would like to share my slide for smoother communication. So here some, here, this is a slide for Professor Roslina Ismail's lecture. And okay, so overall, thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. I especially appreciated being able to see photos of people who actively involved in punk culture in Malaysia. Dr. Roslina's lecture focused on how Muslim women engage in punk culture, specifically highlighting their activities within it. It provided a fascinating insight into how they negotiate between the global secular culture of punk and the local norms of Islam, and how they assert their agency to establish their own identity within this context. So before listening to the lecture, I had certain questions in mind. For instance, I wondered whether practicing punk culture within the boundaries of Islamic norms might dilute punk's critical spirit. In other words, I was concerned that by adhering only to what is permissible under Islamic norms, punk culture might be reduced to a commodified symbol consumed superficially. So, however, after listening to Dr. Roslina's lecture, I realized that what happens on a micro level in people's practices is far more complex. A key takeaway was that human experience do not align 100% with any single culture, religion, or identity. They exist in the spaces between them. Thus, negotiating between punk culture and Islam to make one's presence visible can serve as a resistance against both Western centrism and male-dominated perspectives. For example, the case of using a hijab to conceal bleached hair struck me as a fascinating instance of disguise that cleverly utilizes Islamic norms. This example highlighted how specific modes of negotiation are crucial. In this sense, my perception of women incorporating punk fashion into their everyday attire rather than adopting hardcore styles such as mohawks has shifted significantly. So in that sense, I was very, glad to listen to such a wonderful lecture. And if you have some comments on my quick response, please feel free to express your ideas or comments.
We were not aware of this negotiation of punk culture, and I've never been. I've been to some underground gig, but never like as a researcher. It's always like something that I followed my husband, because my husband was from the punk scene when he was younger. So when we wanted to do this research, he actually make the contact from his previous people that they know. So especially the owner of the Rumah Api, or the firehouse, which is the main gig, right? Because that he called them, and then also put us together with one of the participants who is a vocalist in the funk band, women funk band, because so that kind of easy for us to go into it. So this is where myself, Dr. Mia and myself, we went into the gig to see it firsthand, right? Then after that, we started. Everything was like easy in a way that they were very welcoming, which is very surprising for us. They welcome this idea of us very interested in their life, and not to see them as the yellow culture or the moral panic, or to have this judgment, right, about who they are. So they're really, really open about telling what they do. They were like actually very happy, right? Dr. Mia, would you like to share your first experience when we first went to Rumah Api? Because my husband did go, so he said, "You'll be safe." I said, "Are you sure?" They look very, no, they are the nicest people. They will protect you. Don't worry. So when And I was very surprised that my husband didn't go, because usually if I were to do field work, like certain that have some risk, he will be my bodyguard. So it's, no, you and Mia go, because I fully trust my community. That's what I say. They will take care of you. And true enough, we feel very safe and very at home. So maybe Dr. Mia, as someone not from Malaysia, not Muslim, and not Malay, would like to share her very interesting experience, the first experience. Yeah.
Yeah, well, for me, I think in the very beginning, I wasn't quite scared to go to the scene, but for me, I was more likely worried if these women are willing to share their life stories, because based on what I read about the Malaysia's underground scene, they're a group that is quite stigmatized by the general public. So the very beginning, I really worry if these women are, there to speak out their stories or willingness to share their stories. But everything just went through so well, and everyone is very excited to share their stories with us. And in the end, I think even though the scene is quite Malaysian dominated, like me, the figure who came to the scene, it's like people can immediately tell I am a foreigner. But in the end, like everybody knows you're the girl who's doing research here, right? So they recognize me, and they really welcome me to explore their culture in the end. Yeah.
So, can I ask you a very basic question? So, Tuma Happy is in Kuala Lumpur, right?
Yeah.
Where in Kuala Lumpur? KLCC or?
It's somewhere outside of Kuala, not outside. I think it's about 30 minutes from University Malaya. It's really near. We can bring you, because after Ramadan, there will be a lot of, because I think they rest for the whole of Ramadan, which is what Dr. Mia asked me. It's been really quiet. There's no gig. Is there a law against that beating them from performing? I said there's no a specific law, but then it's Ramadan is a month of reflection, and they kind of like stand down a bit. So I'm sure after Ramadan, everybody is, so we will and it will be much fun. Also, the gig venue also doesn't want to attract unwanted attention, because there are also people who, as you said, Dr. Mia said, they were stigmatized people. Just looking at their mohawk, people think that they are really bad person doing crime, and I also have that idea, that both of us were quite scared when Dr. Mia saw that. Where's your husband? He said, no, he said, you guys go, I'm okay. I already did my contact. You will be safe there. You are safer there than anywhere else. That's what he said. And true enough, people are so welcoming, and they appreciate, right, Dr. Mia, that we actually got interest to know about them, rather than writing about them. We wanted to hear their own voice. So hence, that's why we give the visual ethnography rather than putting words into our own research. We let the images or the visual, because we are visual culture researcher, we let the visual talk for itself, and also from that visual, let the participant talk about that visual. It's not from our own voice. So we're just a storyteller or someone that actually reporting it and it from different contexts. So I believe due to that, we managed to kind of put aside our biasness or personal interpretation or judgment, and present it as is. Right? So yeah, Rumah Api is outside. There will be gigs. We will contacting you, and we will bring it issue to everyone. Yeah.
So in general, the punk scene is kind of stigmatized here in Malaysia because Malaysia is an Islamic country. But when you actually arrived at Luma Happy and some other punk scenes, punk houses, you found some sort of, the friendly atmosphere and the DIY culture and some sort of mutual aid or, some sort of a negotiation to establish their own identity. So how did you, this is a question to Dr. Mia, but you are from Singapore. You are born and raised in Singapore. And how did you like get interested in this kind of like the Muslim punk culture in Malaysia?
I
Do you
am from
find
China, actually.
hmm?
I'm from China.
China, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
So how did you, like get interested in this kind of atmosphere, this kind of like cultural practices here in Malaysia?
Well, I think this is because I have a fashion background. So
Uh-huh.
the first time I got to learn punk is from the textbook of the Vivian Westwood,
Mm,
the punk fashion and that kind of thing. So this edgy style really attracts me to explore the
mm,
subcultural aesthetics. And
mm,
there's some chances I got to know there's a vibrant subculture scene in Malaysia.
mm,
And
mm.
so, yeah, basically this is the reason why
Yeah,
yeah.
interesting. Thank you. So, okay. So actually, I have a question from Professor Eriko Yamato, who got a PhD here in Malaysia, and she works as a Japanese language educator in Vietnam. So she lived in Kuala Lumpur for like more than 10 years and have some like knowledge about the local scenes. And here is a question from Professor Dr. Eriko Yamato. So thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing such insightful findings. Apologies for not being able to attend the session due to my work schedule. I have a few questions. Please answer a few of mine if you could. So the first question is, I observed that some women in Malaysia adjusted their attire depending on the context, while others changed their clothing choices over their lifespan. Regarding to the findings presented in Fashion Theory Journal, were the interviews conducted by a non-Muslim researcher? Is there any past research addresses the interpretations of hijab wearing among Malaysian Muslim women? One participant mentioned that she became part of punk culture due to a friend influence. How about the other six participants? What factors connected them to punk culture? Okay, so here is a question from Dr. Iko Yamato. And do you have some like answers to this?
Okay. Thank you
Yeah.
for the question. And the interviews were conducted by me, a
Mm,
non-Muslim researcher from China. And
mm,
I think my role as an outsider allowed for a relatively reflexive perspective,
mm,
as the participants sometimes might feel freer to explain their views in the greater detail, especially around the intersections of religion, subculture, and
mm,
well, in terms of the existing research, there are a lot of attention to Muslim punks in the Western context. For
mm,
example, studies have shown that Muslim punks in the West face challenges both inside and outside the scene, especially within the punk community. Those Muslim punks in the West context, they are often seen as inauthentic due to their religious dress and styles,
mm,
especially the hijabi wearing women who are sometimes positioned at the margins of the subculture due to the assumptions about passivity or modesty
mm,
conflicting with punk's rebellious ethos. And domestically, there are earlier scholarships that often assume religious women always follow the very fixed and modest dress codes and are like do not care about fashion trends.
mm,
However, we read the more recent Malaysian studies have shown that the hijab wearing women, they are highly engaged in fashion as a form of expression. So which means
mm,
on one hand, they are expected to follow the modest norms in terms of fashion style, but on the other hand, they also seek to display or express their individuality through fashion. So these kind of themes are very relevant to our research of these
mm.
be wearing female punks. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your answer. Okay, to be honest, I feel like I have the same bias with the previous researches because before listening to Dr. Roslina's lecture, like online lecture, I I kind of viewed I kind of thought the punk culture and the Islamic norms are kind of confrontational. So I feel like in that sense I have the same I took the same mistake to the previous researches because the but as you explained and as Professor Roslin explained in the online lecture, what is interesting about your research is like the very the dynamism in the micro level. So sometimes people utilize, the Islamic norms to hide their punk identity in, the official setting or in school. Like as I said, the people use the hijab to hide the bleached hair in school. And on the other occasions, probably there are some, similar practice to utilize punk culture to counter against or to negotiate with the Islamic norms. So thank you very much for your great answer. What about can I ask you one more question in conjunction with Professor Eriko Yamato's question? So how do you find I mean, this is a question to Dr. Mia, the interviewer in this project. So you are a researcher from China and you speak probably Mandarin Chinese and English to do interview with the local people. How would you how do you find your ethnic identity or gender identity or the linguistic identity to conduct this kind of research? Because the majority of the interviewees are Malay women whose mother tongue is Bahasa Melayu, right? And you are they recognize you are not a Muslim. So what kind of advantage and disadvantage do you find in conducting interview with local Muslim women?
Well, I think in terms of the advantages, like I
Mm,
mentioned earlier, my role as an outsider, I think it allowed for a very reflexive perspective. And the
mm,
participants, because I'm not from Malaysia, and the punk subculture is very much stigmatized in Malaysia by the
mm,
public. So these participants don't really assume I hold
mm,
the same perceptions toward the stereotypical perceptions toward them.
mm,
So I
mm,
think they generally more feel freer to share and to explain their
mm,
life stories. Yeah, I think
mm,
that is definitely one of the biggest disadvantages. I think is the language, especially
mm,
a lot of the lyrics were written in Malay language. So actually, I'm currently writing on another paper, trying to analyze their songs, their lyrics.
mm,
So I realize because I do not read Malay language, so
mm,
when I read the translation, I feel something might have been lost because
mm,
I don't speak this language. I think yeah, that is the
mm,
disadvantages. I
mhm.
think yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Mia just mentioned about Vivienne Westwood. I found the concept of the selective adoption of punk symbols very interesting. And is there any tendency to model oneself after specific individuals or specific bands or specific, designer? Because Dr. Mia mentioned Vivienne Westwood, and Vivienne Westwood is also very popular in Japan. And in Japan, for example, in Japan, punk fashion is often considered to involve wearing, something, by Vivienne Westwood, for example, while taking inspiration from, bands, the real punk bands like the Sex Pistols. So is this also the case in Malaysia or is it different?
Yeah, actually, to my surprise, because in the very beginning, I learned punk subculture from Vivienne Westwood, right? So I also assume Vivienne Westwood is a very influential and strong figure in Malaysia. But actually, to my surprise, there's only one participant who mentioned Vivienne Westwood. I think the fashion in the Malaysia's punk subculture scene mainly is about DIY. They make their own fashion products instead of buying from the overseas fashion brands. Especially Vivienne Westwood is considered as a very big fashion brand, and it's the influence of consumer commerce for them. So they would prefer to make the fashion and make the record by themselves instead of buying from those big fashion brands. Yeah, I was also surprised by that, actually.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you very much.
You're
Can I
welcome.
can I add my question to Professor Hirashi's question? So, both of you mentioned Vivienne Westwood and Sex Pistols. So does that mean like the punk influence is from UK rather than US in this country?
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, but in Japan, I'm talking about Japan, and in
Yeah.
Japan, I think punk fashion is it's considered
Um,
uh it come from UK,
mm,
not the US.
mm.
And
So
how
it's
about
same in
Yeah, I can add to that because Malaysia was colonized by the British government,
mm,
and our education system was set up following the British education system. For
mm,
English is British English, and although we have achieved 65 years of independence, 60 odd years of independence, we still have a lot of that influence, right?
mm,
So hence, in the 1980s, during the Industrial Revolution in Malaysia, where Malaysia is when our previous Prime Minister Tun Dr. Mahathir will say that look Japanese, looking East policy,
mm,
but also due to our shift towards from agriculture towards to a industrial nation,
mm,
students were given full government scholarship to do their studies overseas, especially UK. So hence, I
mm,
think that's a cross culture that was brought back, especially UK. Not so much US, and UK usually is on STEM, engineering, medicine, and just a few people who's doing arts and humanity. But from there is where
mm,
it brings back to us. Maybe you were sent like in the 80s, right? So after 3 years, you come back, and that is when the
mm,
punk subculture in the UK is at the top peak. So it
mm,
came back, but it's being localized. Same thing with our artists in Malaysia, our abstract expressionist artists. They
mm,
studied in New York
mm,
School, Pratt Institute, Slade School in the UK, and discovered abstract expressionism, discovered abstraction. But when they come back, it become localized.
mm,
Because as if you look at New York School, the abstract expressionist is just more on self-expression. But then when they come back, these artists localize this abstract expressionist as a form of religious or spiritual, more like Rothko type
mm,
of process, art process. So this is what happened. We go out and then we come back. We bring certain ideologies or certain culture, and we delocalize it to suit our situation. Same thing with
mm,
punk. So
mm.
those the earlier punk people are those who studied overseas. Those are from the overseas, and also they got the records and everything. Yes, it started with Vivienne Westwood, but then when it comes here, it become localized. It become
Yeah,
defined.
something different. Yeah,
Yeah. So this is where
interesting.
we very interesting on to
Yeah.
really map it out, how it came to this, it has their own committee and they have their own
Mm.
idea what punk is about. Yeah.
The first question is relationship with economic growth. So, living in Malaysia, I can sense the country's economic growth, like, that is totally different to, the today's condition in Japan. But however, it seems that the movements like distributing meals to the homeless arise because some people are left behind by this growth. If possible, could you elaborate further on the relationship between punk culture and Malaysia's economic landscape?
So during 1980s and 1990s, Malaysia underwent the very rapid economic and social transformation under the new economic policy. And it aims to restructure the society and to reduce the economic disparities among different ethnic groups. And this leads to the increased urbanization. So a growing Malay middle class and expanded access to the education and employment. But alongside this economic liberalization, Malaysia's political environment grew increasingly authoritarian. So despite this democratic framework, the state maintained very strict control over media and public discourse through the legislation. So often stifling the dissent and suppressing the alternative voices. So this is why the subcultures such as the punk and the death metal, black metal arise in Malaysia and got popular in Malaysia at the very beginning during that time period.
So in connection to the economic, so this is also as a form of reaction between that urbanization, because they are marginalized people in the urban area, which being marginalized economically because of the material wealth and the materialism in the urban, right? So this actually set up a whole new perspective on how people respond to that, to capitalism. So hence that's why the punk in subculture in Malaysia is about the DIY ethos, that is to go against consumerism. They kind of create their own economy within themselves, where they exchange, without having that capitalism as a core of that of their own community. So this is where we see how people specifically at micro level make informed decision and choice to limit the invasions of consumerism and material. So it does look very idealistic. It is very idealistic. We were very surprised how idealistic it was for them to bring. But they somehow make it in their own small way at micro level how to come up with. So when in one of our paper we said that during the gig, it's a point where they meet and they exchange each other's work. I give you my t-shirt, you give me my painting and things like that, and they wear each other's t-shirt, right, as a support to give money or maybe make their own zine. So, and most of them will have a day job, right, Mia?
Yes, they're like full-time professionals doing various kind of jobs.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the like social culture or social economic background of like those who are participating in punk scenes in Malaysia, because in order to criticize or in order to problematize the commercialism, you have to be like somehow educated. So, but at the same time, the punk is originally a working class culture. So, and as like you explained that there are like those who are marginalized, those who are left behind the economic growth in Malaysia in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, 19th century, like this kind of people who are like the left behind the economic growth might be like not educated well. So I'm curious how, what kind of people are actually doing this, like, punk culture in Malaysia to criticize or to go against the consumer capitalism or like globalization.
Well, in fact, most of them are graduated from universities. Like more than half of them graduate from universities, and the rest are graduate from high school. And they are from a very different social background. Some of them from middle class, and some of them from the working class family background. And for now, the all have their own full-time job to do. And one of the women even work for the government, but she's also a punk. So we see this kind of contradictory, very, very interesting in Malaysia's social cultural environment.
The aspect of class struggle was fundamental to the punk in the UK, right? But it doesn't. In Malaysia, there's no aspect of such, class struggle, and rather than that, the people who are engaging in punk activism is more educated and more high class people, and it's very interesting. And so in that case, they are not interested in, they're not intending the class to problematize the class struggle, but because in Japan it's very different, and there's no aspect, the aspect of class struggle is almost non-existent in Japanese punk culture or punk fashion. So yeah, I'd like to ask about that.
I think based on our research in Malaysia, we don't really see too much in terms of the class struggles at all. What we see, I think, is more likely to be the identity politics in Malaysia. So this kind of young group are trying to figure out who they are or who they want to be in this society, especially in terms of the economic growth and the religious regulations. They are trying to figure out who they are. So instead of fighting with the class, we don't really see too much about the class struggles. They are more into expressing who they are or trying to figure out who they are or who they want to be, and they care about the friendship, the community, and they build up their community through DIY, through supporting each other's and trying to figure out how to be a better person. This is what we found in the Malaysia's punk underground scene.
I think in that way, so maybe we can say, the class struggle aspects in the original punk culture is lost in Malaysia when this culture was imported from UK to Malaysia. But instead, the local people here in Malaysia utilizes like this, the culture, like iconography as a tool to establish their own cultural identity. As Dr. Mio just said, they are doing identity politics by using, this kind of punk culture. This is not like always negative. Like, when I say, the class struggle is lost in punk scenes in Malaysia, that might sound like somehow negative. And to some extent, it's true. But at the same time, there are some sort of dynamism among the people who utilize this, global commercial culture to express their own identity.
In terms of class struggle, we do have some collective that actually work on that. If you look at the gig scene, maybe not, but we also have artists who identified themselves as punk community. Let's say punk rock sulap, Fahmi Reza, these are all that actually voice out through visuals on the class struggle. So you can explore punk rock sulap artwork, so this is not from the music scene, but from the art scene, that it is very the idea of activism and on social issues, especially on the issues from the Sabah and Sarawak, because they're from the Sabah, from that side. So they are being invited to biennales and everything. They make very large print works. So perhaps this is something that we can also explore. But within the context of the punk music scene, our finding is based on that also. Our findings is that more on identity politics, but also class struggle, but within that identity politics. So the core of their, because they believe that if they do that, the stigmatization and also is already there. It would be not productive for them. They wouldn't be able to do more within themselves and the collective, because they attention is always about their own identity, and also within that people within that outside of the urban people, you know. So as I said, punk movement came back from the student who studies there. So of course they came back from the educated people. Okay, and also from the zine that they read, you know, because it's all in English. So basically, for them to understand what punk is about, they have to learn English, right? Because they have the punk Bible and everything. So I remember people who maybe from high school, or even they were in a friend of mine who said, I learned English because I wanted to know about punk. I because I don't know, I cannot speak English, but I learn English because I want to read about the punk Bible or punk theology from the UK, because I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the alternative narrative of who we are as a country, or who we are as a society. So I think it's not about the education level, whether they are high school or graduates. It's about the curiosity and the idea of how they can situate themselves, because in the 1980s, 1990s, urbanization is just too fast for everyone to actually get hold, that they found that they are lost within the system. So hence they created this. So identity politics as the core, yes, but there are activism also within that. Yeah.
So that means identity politics is a starting point to start, more like social issues. So the next question is about the presence of Chinese communities. So I sometimes go to ACG events like anime, comics, and game like cultural events here in Kuala Lumpur, and I often see that the presence of Chinese Malaysians are very strong, like compared to their share of the overall population. So in according to the statistics, the 30% of the population is Chinese. But when I go to ACG event, the percentage of Chinese people are more than like 50, like maybe let's say like 60 or 70% of like people who come to ACG events are Chinese. So I assume like this kind of ACG events in here in Malaysia is originated to the cultural practices of Chinese Malaysians. But how is the situation in punk scenes? The majority are Chinese Malaysians, or other ethnic backgrounds?
It's a very interesting observation. Well, the dynamic is quite different in Malaysia's punk scene, actually. From our field work, the majority of the participants in the punk scene are Malay youth, with only relatively very few Chinese Malaysians involved in the scene. I think this contrast is likely stems from the differences in how the subcultural space like punk is shaped by language, religion, and the like we said, identity politics in Malaysia. Punk in Malaysia is emerged as a form of social and political resistance, often engaging directly with issues like the Islam or Malay nationalism themes that probably are more naturally resonate more with the Malay youth instead of the Malaysian Chinese, especially those navigating the cultural and state pressures. But like the ACG activities, or more like the fashion sense, where the language and religious identities may not play as the central role as punk, from my point of view.
Yeah, it is a very interesting observation to look within the ACG and also the punk scene. The ACG is considered the mainstream, main culture. It's within that consumerism space, right? Because games event were organized by games developer, the company, right? Whereas punk is a self-made seed. It's a collective that has no is not identified or core as as a
Mm,
consumerism from a consumerism. So I guess the difference is with this within that, because it started out as anti-consumerism. So
mm,
it brings to, as what Mia said, that due to the religious intersectionality, due to the urbanization, Malay urbans, which is marginalized from within, from the
mm,
national economic policy. So they were like on this,
mm,
on the side. So I think this is where it creates that fertile ground for this subculture,
mm,
because they don't consider ACG as a subculture. It's a mainstream culture,
mm.
right? So
I, I think your answer is quite interesting for me because you said like ACG culture is a mainstream culture because it's a commercialized. Like, probably people who are in ACG culture, like anime, comics, and game here in Malaysia, probably they think themselves stigmatized because anime
yeah.
is somehow, it's not the main culture from the people who participate in ACD, but from the point of view, those who study, like, the Malaysian Muslim punk, the ACG looks like a mainstream culture. That is
Yes,
quite
yes.
interesting. And I think your comment is quite like valid because like ACG, okay, so the ACG culture is originally a DIY culture because like 20 or 25 years ago here in Malaysia, the local Chinese Malaysians established like kind of like cultural society to do a kind of DIY event of ACG culture. But in the past 20 years, like this venue was kind of recognized by the big companies and the capitals, and it
Mm,
is fully commercialized today.
yeah.
So
Mm,
probably that sort of, the culture changes in the culture in ACG culture is quite interesting. And so while your lecture focused on women, are punk performances and gigs gender segregated? So okay, this is a very simple question. The sites, the gigs of punk in here in Malaysia is like gender separated. Many photos seem to show men and women together. So although today's discussion is centered on women, it doesn't mean that the only women participating in punk culture. So I'm curious if my understanding is correct or not.
Well, the scene is quite tight knit, and there are both men and women are participating together, right?
Mm,
Um, because the scenes, it's really small, around 40 to 50 active participants at
mm,
any given event in Kuala Lumpur. So out of those, there were fewer than 10 are women, including both
mm,
the women who are wearing the hijab and those who are not visibly Muslims.
mm,
So the male presence is significantly stronger, and the
mm,
female Muslim punks remain a very small minority. And there are like fewer than 5 punk bands in Malaysia with the
mm,
visibly Muslim female members.
mm,
So that's why we are very curious about these minority groups, like how they survive or how they position themselves within
mm,
this male-dominated scene.
mm,
So yeah, that's why we choose to
mm,
explore and research on this small group.
mm. So you said the punk scene is quite small here in Malaysia, but your lecture mentioned the punk scene in Kuala Lumpur and Malacca, right? But is there any other, the punk bands or punk scenes out of Kuala Lumpur and Malacca?
Yes, there are
Mm,
different locations in Malaysia in terms of the punk bands, but Kuala Lumpur presents the most prominent scene in
mm,
Malaysia. So that's
mm.
why we choose to research around the Kuala Lumpur scenes.
So in terms of feminism, the riot girl movement from the 1990s seems crucial, right? And culturally speaking, the Malaysian appear to have been more influenced by the UK, as we have already discussed. But has there been any impact from the US West Coast riot girl movement? Because, okay, I think I can combine the next question to this question. So I'm also curious about the specific AI cultures. The riot girl movement places significant importance on genes, like the riot girl movements the participants of the movement made so many kinds of genes to publish their ideas or to fight against the male-dominant society. So do people create, so the Malaysian people, the people who engage in the punk movement here in Malaysia create genes of like punk culture? If so, what languages are they written in and what topics do they typically cover?
Malaysia's punk scene is not really directly shaped by the white girl as a movement. While some participants, especially the women, they aware of it and maybe resonate with its DIY efforts or the family stance. But its aesthetic or the ideological influence is relatively limited. Instead, the punk culture in Malaysia tends to be more grounded in the local political and socio-cultural realities, particularly like we discussed earlier, the issues related to the things like religion or the state control. But yeah, the women like in our research, the female Muslim punks, the tension between the religious modesty and punk rebellion very much shapes their self-expression in very specific ways that we cannot find or that is not mirrored in the right girls' gender politics, right? So the Malaysian punk scene is more grounded in the local context instead of adopting the right girl directly for those female Muslim punks who navigate the feminism and resistance through their own terms in Malaysia. Yeah.
Interesting.
So
Thank you.
we think
go ahead.
yeah, it's more like a localized and context-sensitive form of resistance. So that's how Dr. Lin explained earlier. It's imported from the Western and then localized within the specific social cultural context in Malaysia.
Agree. During Dr. Mia's Viva, I think one of the panel mentioned about the US context of punk, like why we were not looking into that also. So that might be our next future research to see how is there any kind of documentation or mapping from the west coast of US, right? Which part of this punk scene in Malaysia comes from the UK part, you know, the grassroots of it. But in the end, we don't see any much significance because in the end, it will be localized. It will be localized to our own context. So we believe that this localization of subculture happens in not just in Malaysia, happens in Indonesia, happens in Japan, if maybe because as is, they are part of a community, you know, and they cannot live within the isolation by adopting wholly what the Western context or ideals of what subculture is. So then subculture is anything outside of the main culture. Right? So if somebody said that Malaysian punk is a different kind of punk, it is because it is part of that social engineering. It is part of that society that you cannot divorce yourself from cultural context of that society. And in negotiating the identity, which is the identity politic, is the main for them to ground themselves on who they are, to maintain their ideals or their beliefs in what punk stands for, and also to be relevant to who they are as part of that community. So I think which is very interesting because we never thought it would be like that. We always thought that before we coming in, the bias that we have ourselves is that they are, you know, a separate entity that does not live within that. But we realize they are parents, they are mothers, they are fathers, they are teachers, they are lecturers, they are, you know, food grab delivery, you know, that actually have interaction, day-to-day interaction with other people. Now, how do they negotiate themselves then? So I guess this gig or this community meet up or gigs give them that separate a space, a safe space for them to explore this identity without being stigmatized, without being judged. So that's why they are very tight-knit, because they really protect it, because that's the space where them being marginalized in that urbanization context in terms of economy, in terms of the benefits of the national economic policy, right? So they are like those people who that sleep within the government's idea of what good citizen is, that they create that space for them. So which is especially more significant with the hijab Muslim. You know, how do they? I never thought there's a hijab wearing women as a punk band vocalist and punk band. They toured in Indonesia. I think they just had the tour in Indonesia, and it was really, they're like the flower there, you know, because they're so unique in itself, right? In themselves.
Okay. So I have a question about the Malaysia's distance from like US culture. This question is not limited to punk scenes, but also the general distance from like US culture. I feel like probably because I'm from Japan, Japan was under occupation of the United States after World War II is over. So, the US culture is quite dominant in Japan, even today. But so as a Japanese person who came to Malaysia, I feel like Malaysia people are distancing from like US culture and more, more relying on to the UK culture rather than US culture. So this is a kind of context I asked the question about the influence of the Riot Guy rather than like Vivian Westwood. But how do you find like do you feel like because the United States is a strongest supporter of Israel for more than half a century. So do you think there are some sort of like dislike or hatred against like US commercial or popular culture in Malaysia?
We embrace outside culture, right? We embrace it. I don't see part of that, because that for me, I would like to explore that further actually, because for me as personally, and what I have observed around the people around my community and within that I interact, there's no hatred about this US culture or UK culture. But somehow it comes in and it's going to be either you adopt it or you just localize it to suit your living condition, your what is expectation of you, so that you can still because most of us can speak English very well, because our TV, our social medias, our media are all on that Hollywood-based movies. Our schools, remember, are based from British education system. So the way history was taught, the way culture was taught, and we adopt Western philosophy. Okay, so I don't see any hatred but maybe in a certain issues, right? What is happening around the world, right? When America is seen as this within this ideal, or supporting this or supporting that. But in terms of the culture itself, I don't see much of that. So maybe this is something that I would want to explore further and see whether there is some strong sense of that hatred. I know it's a strong word for that,
Yeah.
of resistance towards this, but I don't see it. Like, we kind of embrace Western culture, and somehow we turn it into something that suits us. So I don't know.
I think the key word which penetrate your lecture and our conversation today is like localization, utilization, and appropriation. Before listening to your lecture, my biased view is like kind of like confrontational. So I put the Islamic culture, Islamic norms, and secular punk culture like confrontational. But in reality, like as you like discussed in your online lecture, like people are like, I mean, female Muslim practitioner punk culture is utilizing like, the both sides of the cultures, secular culture or like religious culture to establish their identity. So that's why like I kind of reflected on my biased view of, confronting like, many things. Thank you for your great answer. So this is the last question from me, and the question is about hijab cosplay. So what are your thoughts on hijab cosplay at this stage? Because we know each other because we are doing some like joint research project on hijab cosplay. So I'd like to hear uh, what kind of ideas, what kind of findings can be applicable to our future project on hijab cosplay.
Um, I try. Well, I think the cosplay is also a foreign culture, right? So I think our framework, the localization of subcultures, probably very much relevant to understanding how the foreign culture originate from Japan, right? Then localized in Malaysia. I think there are some similarities and there will be of course some differences when we apply our framework of localization of subculture. And of course, I really looking forward to see the answer of like what the differences and what are the similarities.
So, looking at hijab cosplay, I'm just fascinated with the creativity of it all. I'm just so fascinated. Like you wear pink hijabs and then turn it into anime hair and all the makeups and things like that, and with the big bow, with still the hijab. So I'm just fascinated. Like how creative can these people be? So I wanted to know the motivation. I wanted to know that whether, as we mentioned, appropriation or versus appreciation, and how it's being localized. So it's something that I look forward to explore further with this cosplay, because we have not gone into it yet. So I won't be able to say. But I believe that the framework that we propose in the localization of subculture would have some context in it, would be able to be employed, and we'll see how. I mean, also based on the findings that we have.
One of the great difference between like female punk culture here in Malaysia and hijab cosplay is the existence of like societal issues after doing this kind of cultural practices. So as we have discussed today, like if you are in punk culture, like female or male, after utilizing some sort of like the punk iconography from UK to establish their own identity for their own identity politics, they are gonna be open to the societal issues in the local context. So the social, like the social stratification or poverty, or people who are suffered from poverty and left behind the economic growth. So that's why, like, those who are in this punk scene participate into the, delivery of free meal to the homeless people. But I think that kind of, like, the social, like, the consciousness that the social issues are doesn't exist in hijab cosplay, because they are like recreating the anime and manga world, which is 100% fiction. I wouldn't mean that that is a problem, because you need a fiction to establish your own identity. But in comparison with the punk culture,
It's
the
the reality.
route to the, the
Reality. It's based on the
yeah,
it's based on the reality of life, and then
yeah,
that is how they respond to it.
mhm,
Whereas
mm,
anime is from the fiction, so it's
yeah,
like an I don't know whether I can say this, an escapism,
mm,
because of it's from a different reality. It's from a
yeah,
fantasy or fiction, and then they put that as a reality.
mhm,
So perhaps the motivation has
yeah.
different. That's
Mhm,
why it's very interesting and
mhm,
exciting to look further into
mhm.
this. Yeah. Mm.
So that is still a hypothesis at this moment. So
Yep.
I'm
Yep.
looking for to do like joint research project with you.
And can I
Any?
ask a small question, small and
Go
subtle
ahead.
question? Do you know British TV drama Real Lady Parts? Yes, and is it watched in Malaysia as well? Because
Yeah,
yeah,
I think it's in the Netflix, right? So anything with
okay,
streaming, we can access it.
yeah,
It's not in the mainstream media from
yeah.
the
But I found it's very interesting because the drama is focused on British all-female Muslim punk bands.
Mm.
So I think it will be very interesting if you can tell us that what's the difference between the similarity and the differences between this UK all-female Muslim punk culture. Well, it's fiction, of course, but the real Muslim punk culture in Malaysia.
Yeah, it would be something, to actually perhaps because the female ladies part is more like a fictionalized story, a movie, like a
Yeah.
storytelling about. It would be interesting to see if it based on something which a reality also in Malaysia, right?
Yeah.
Do they have that kind of resistance from the family? Yes, they do. From our interviews, they do have that resistance. They do have like the parents, are not agreeing, but in the end, I think what happened was that the parents see that the child or their children is not worse. In fact, it gives them a sense of um, a community. So she explained, one of our participants who is the vocalist of the punk band explained to her mother what she's a straight edge. There's a straight edge. She does not involve in this. She got married to someone who understand her, who let her be who she is. In the weekend she will jump on the stage, and play the drums or singing and in her punk voice. But she also live a married life with a husband or a partner that actually understand who she is. So it's about that. It's about situating herself within within a support system that really believe in what her that if you don't believe you don't agree with me, then I'm not going to have anything to do with you. I think they put that boundaries already. The other one, they are sisters. The other one married another metal musician. Metal. So they can jam together. So it's more like partnership. So it's also important for them. It's also important to find their people so that they don't have to depend on what other things about them. Because their people is the one that have that. So for me, looking at that series, it it's about their struggles on how to situate themselves within the mainstream. Here, they don't. They create their own
Okay.
space. They create the third space. So they don't have to struggle about what people think of them. If you don't believe in me, if you don't want me, you don't like me, I don't mind. I have my people community. That's why I think the reason why it is so tight knit, because they know if they're not together, they will drown in the main, moral panic, stigmatization. They are being seen as yellow culture, yellow stain culture. All those things were labeled on them. So it's okay. They create that alternative world within themselves. So, but if they were to be part of the society, wear normal clothing or
Yeah.
something like that. They
Okay.
because it is what is needed of them to be that, find a job, to make a living, to be within a family. So they don't push their ideology like accept me, you know, like so.
Yeah.
I'm within this, then there's a saying in Malay proverb saying that bila masuk kandang kambing mengembek. So if you're in a sheep dance, you bar, you don't roar, you don't hiss, you become like a sheep. It's not about giving up. It's not about exchanging or you are selling yourself cheap. It's about understanding what the communities needed, so that they are able, when they needed, they are within that tight. So I think that is the reason why it is so tight knit, because they within their people, the very their people, or they have a family which understand and know that they are not bad people, they are not doing drugs or something. Yeah, that's why, of course, the mother is very concerned why you're in this gig, Of course, the mother never go, but she explained it. She explained, she shared with them, and the mother said, okay lah, she met someone who understand, who's not from the scene, but understand her. Let her believe and trust. So I think this is our participant from our findings. We cannot overgeneralize it lah from sickness, but I think most of it is that they just within that people, so that when they have to go out, if they were to go out, they will dress down a bit
Yeah.
not to be too sticking out in that, to avoid this unwanted attention, because it's not about attention. They become a mohawk, they wearing stud. It's not about creating attention to them. I think this is the reason, right? So, but then if you go to the gig, you will see them, with but it's their gig. So we are the outsider here, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And I think what Dr. Lin said also relates to a very important section of our core findings, which is those female Muslim punks. They also find the compatibility between punk and Islam. So which means they don't want to cause others to feel uncomfortable when they go out. They hang out with the normal kind of people who are not punks. So they choose not to wear those very extreme accessories or makeups or whatever styles will make others feel uncomfortable. This is because they find the compatibility between punk and Islam. So this is the very fascinating point for the Malaysian punk scene based on our findings.
Yeah, based on things. And also, punk to them is the ideology inside. It's not what is outside. So I guess it's always about that connection they have within, rather than how you look or who you look, right? People can just wear their coat and ties and still I'm a punk, because the ideology of that punk, which is, do no racism, no sexism, all their what they believe in. So yeah, so this is how I see it from based on our findings. Yeah, especially with the hijabis, steampunk.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting, fascinating. Thank you so much.
It is. We had so much fun. Dr. said like this. I had so much fun doing my PhD. I'm not sure whether everybody suffer, but I just had so much fun at the fieldwork. Yeah,
So thank you very much for sharing your wonderful insight and the wonderful findings from your previous research on female punk practitioner in Malaysia. And I think we had a good conversation today. And I thank you both, Dr. Roslina Ismail and Dr. Mia Liu, in concluding our Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us, for letting us share, and thank you
so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and selamat Hari Raya.
Thank you.
Yeah, selamat Hari Raya.
I will continue eating my rendang now.
Yeah.